Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois. Welcome to Midday with Reverend Don. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can type your questions or comments into whatever platform you happen to be watching on. They should appear here in my chat room. I have noticed that a couple of the platforms don't. I'm not quite sure why some do and some don't. Um, But even if it doesn't show up in the chat room, I still appreciate your comments, and I love to be able to talk with you directly. It also sometimes seems to me that it's not always logical why certain ones show up and some don't. But I noticed that on my personal Facebook page the other day, there were comments I never saw during the program. Um, and yet I've definitely seen comments from there otherwise. Maybe they were made after the broadcast ended. I accept that as a possibility. But anyway, feel free to make your comments and we will talk back and forth as we normally do. And today I am ending, at least for the moment, my conversation on the subject of diplomacy. But first, I want to, oh, and hello to Fox for a Witch in the chat room. It's good to see you. Um, it, I want to mention I was scheduled to do a metaphysical auction this evening at 7. We are going to reschedule that for Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern. And the reason, of course, is that there is a political convention going on this evening, and the candidate will be making their speech at exactly the same time I was going to do that auction. And from what I can tell, the vast majority of people who might be tuning in for the auction will, in fact, be tuning in for the speech. So we're going to follow the better part of valor and reschedule for another day. So Tuesday at 6, if you want to join Reverend Don's Magic and Metaphysical Auction at Gaia Thrift Central on whatnot.com, and we'll have some wonderful things, including some new artwork from me. And hello to Antonio in the chat room. It's good to see you. One of the things I'm thinking of including in these auctions, which I just referred to, is original artwork from me, and I'm curious to know if people are interested in that. Of course, the way I will tell is whether anybody wants it when I make it available. But if you're interested in original artwork from me, let me know what kind of thing you'd like to see. And also, if you're interested in commissioning a piece, I do artwork for people occasionally. And if you're interested in commissioning a piece, you can direct message me or email me at donlewis@aol.com. For all those people saying, you still have an AOL address? Well, yes, I do. I've had it since the mid-1990s, and I keep it for one reason. And that's that nobody can ever say that they couldn't find my email address, because it's always been the same one. Um, I am very easy to reach that way. My Facebook page has been the same for at least 17 years, if not longer. I tend to try to keep my main contacts as stable as possible. And getting back to diplomacy, which is our stated subject for today, that can be part of diplomacy. On one hand, having the more fashionable address of the moment makes a lot of sense, but on the other hand, having a stable address that never changes makes some sense too. I have both. I mean, I have other more current email addresses also, um, but I keep my old one, and it's usually the one that I give people so that you can always find it. It's mentioned all over the place. And I find that being accessible that way has been very important in my lifetime. And I've occasionally had people try to say they couldn't figure out how to reach me, and my answer has always been, I'm online every day. I'm answering comments most every day. My email address has been the same since 1996, more or less. I'm not at all hard to reach, and um, you should be able to find me. And accessibility, well, it's an interesting question when we come to diplomacy. And part of diplomacy is also, for want of a better way to put it, marketing. And you want to be accessible, um, but part of it also is going to depend on who you are and what you're doing. And hello to Jessica in the chat room. Jessica Garcia, welcome. Um, it depends on who you are, on what you're doing, on what your image is. Having an ancient email address um, wouldn't necessarily be desirable if your image was to be the new hip person, or whatever the term these days might be. Um, but thinking about how you're handling that sort of thing is kind of a part of diplomacy, because how people reach you, when they reach you, how they can communicate with you is part of diplomacy. There's a reason the ambassadorial system is so important in politics, because it's how countries officially communicate with each other. Now, we all know that it's not the only way they do that, but it's how they officially do that. And hello to Reverend Michael in the chat room. It's good to see you. Um, this is true in every aspect of life. How are people going to reach you? And is the way that they reach you going to affect how they view you? Is it going to make you look au courant? Is it going to make you look very traditional? Is it going to make you look very stable? Is it going to make you look like you frequently change? Um, I have tended to take the point of view of being an institution, um, that the way that you reach me, the way you communicate with me stays the same. But that's part of what I do, part of how I represent myself, part of the image that I put forward, all of which is part of diplomacy. The way you dress is part of your diplomacy. It's silent diplomacy. I often tell the story from my late friend Pete Pathfinder, who was one of my great mentors in life, who talked about when he applied to become part of the Washington State Interfaith Council. A different Wiccan group opposed his presence there, and they asked to address the council. Oh, and hello to CDC, who says, great topic. Thank you, CDC. But they wanted to address the council on why he should not be able to represent the Wiccan faith. Well, the first problem with that is he wasn't representing the Wiccan faith, he was representing the Aquarian Tabernacle Church. But still, they gave them the chance to come and address the council. And he said that being brand new, um, and only slightly knowing these people, he was very worried about how this was going to go until he got there. And he got there, and he was wearing a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches and that very buttoned down look. And they showed up uniformly dressed in all black and lots of silver jewelry. Not to say there's anything inherently wrong with that, but it certainly was not reading the audience. And he said that within a few moments, he could tell as he watched the members of the council look at him and look at them, that there was no question he was going to be on that council, because the group that objected to him had not considered who they were talking to or how they were going to impress them. And they did not impress them in the positive. That's not to say that you can't dress in all black and silver and create a positive impression, even on a fairly conservative audience, but you have to think about how you're doing it. I've done it. But you have to think about the audience you're speaking to. Pete definitely did. And, he could be um, much less formal than that tweed jacket and more formal when occasion demanded it, but he considered who he was talking to. Um, I was saying the other day, you have to meet your audience where you find them. A lot of people will think, well, they should accept me as I am. Well, that's nice, but it isn't necessarily what's going to happen. You have to consider who you're talking to. You can convince them to accept you as you are, but you first have to get their positive attention. You have to have them listen to you long enough to be able to see who you are, rather than whatever stereotype they may have. So playing directly into the stereotype may not be the thing to do. Starhawk, great author, well-known activist, she wrote about this also. I believe that it is in The Spiral Dance, but might be in a different book. But she talked about how if you're going to speak to a government body of some sort, the city council, a Senate commission, whatever you may have the opportunity to address, that's not the time to wear your favorite witchy t-shirt. That's the time to put on your tie or your pearls, as the case may be, because you're not trying to have a contest of wills. You're trying to get through their walls to deliver your message. And speaking a language they understand is most commonly how you're going to do that. Appearing in a way they think of as respectable, or at least reasonably so, is kind of important, and using language they understand. I was speaking the other day about the importance of interfaith language. It's very important when you're speaking to people outside of your own background. It's important to them too. They just don't usually know it because there tend to be more of them. And they're not too concerned about working people to understand their point of view. They just assume people understand theirs. But that's not always true either. And sometimes their language is very off-putting to people from other backgrounds. But when you're the minority, you need to think about this. And if it's your first occasion at the local interfaith organization, using interfaith language is a very good idea. And that includes things like, if you're going to talk about the things your temple does, talk about your worship services, talk about your community services. Don't immediately use terms like your rituals or your sabbats, because they won't know what it means. Use a term they understand, because your sabbat is a worship service. Why shouldn't you call it that? And they will understand that. Now, later in the conversation, you can say, well, yeah, now we would normally call it a sabbat. But first, have them listening to you in a friendly way. Then they can hear that. But if you go straight into it, they're not going to hear you. You'll shut their ears down immediately. This is an important part of diplomacy. Now, that's a very obvious situation. There are others too. And this happens within our community, where people using different jargon and different ideas will accidentally alienate one another because it didn't occur to them they might be using different terminology, different ideas, or they come from very different backgrounds with different ways of doing things, and they don't realize that not everyone comes from that background. One of the big problems I saw in the 45 years of my pagan career was that very often people only knew the tradition they came from, thought it was absolutely right on every front, and if someone differed from it, they were wrong. Even though that's often not what they would say, but it's what they thought. And they didn't realize that even within the more narrow branches within paganism, such as Wicca, there are many different ways of doing things. There are some vast differences between different traditions, particularly when we're using the wide definition of Wicca that I use, which is the older definition. Some people have tried to narrow it. I reject that point of view. But even then, you'll still encounter differences between traditions. You always will. And you can't just assume everyone's always going to agree with you. But people did. And this was often the source of some of those witch wars we were talking about the other day. They were terribly offended that anyone had a different liturgical opinion. that some people might have different kinds of personalities, that not everybody was a crafter, for example. There were people who believed everything must be handmade, which not everybody can do. Not everybody has the time to do it. Not everybody has the talent to do it. And frankly, historically, it's not what people did. Um, I have been known to make things by hand. Certainly, I can. But most of my magical tools were not made by hand. Nor would they be more important to me if they had been. Nor, in my opinion, would they be closer connected to my energy. My athame was a gift from my Uncle Edward, and it was a commercial dagger. Beautiful. It was a souvenir of, I believe, the Helsinki Olympics, which also means rather valuable. Beautiful piece. Very traditional design in a Finnish sort of way. Very important to me, but definitely not handmade by anybody. And that would sit very badly with people from some traditions. I know there are some traditions which hold that if you're going to have an athame, you must personally make the blade. I got to tell you, I don't know many people who even know how to go about that in a way that would be anything but absolutely amateurish. Um, and I'm just not really on that same page. But we need to understand, and I understand, that not everyone feels the same way I feel about that. Not everyone comes from the same background as my tradition. My tradition says go buy the damn athame you want. Um, it will mean more to you if you have a feeling for it. And you can build a strong energetic relationship to it through other means than making it. But I also know that there are people who don't feel that way at all. And they think the only way to do it is the way they were taught to do it. And that's fine for them. And so I would never tell them they're wrong as long as they're speaking for themselves. And I also wouldn't generally tell them they're wrong first thing in a conversation. Even if they were trying to speak for other people, I would perhaps say, in my background, we felt differently. That too is the more standard definition of diplomacy. Saying things in pleasant ways. But a better way to put it is saying things in ways that people can hear. It's not about just wanting them to hear it. It's about whether they can hear it. Because often they can't. And going back to Pete and his example of the group that opposed his presence, if I could go back in time to 1980, whatever year that was, and speak to that group before they spoke to that council, I am 100% certain they would not hear a single word I said. Because I would tell them, he's not there to represent you. He's going in to represent his own group. They wouldn't hear that they would have a different point of view. They wouldn't hear that, the way that you're presenting yourselves is going to alienate the very people you're trying to persuade. They wouldn't be able to hear it. This is maybe the most important consideration on the subject of diplomacy. What can your audience hear? Now, I'm not, for the most part, thinking about that in speaking to you today, partly because I think the people who follow me can hear pretty well. And hello to Zane in the chat room. It's good to see you. And that they're open-minded enough that even if I say something they're not familiar with, they will listen. And hopefully this is true. But the other thing is, I've talked about, I'm now retired from my primary position of leadership. I'm not out of the game, and I'm still in a position of leadership, but not as I was. And I now feel free to say things I would not have said before. And that includes being more blunt on some of these subjects. It includes, if I say something that someone doesn't like, oh well. I am not the face of my tradition now. I am maybe the face of Corellian TV. Um, I am the face of my books, but I do feel that when you are in a position of being the face of your organization, you do need to be very conscious of what you're saying, of how you're presenting yourself, of what you're doing. Because people will judge the entire organization based on it. Um, if you are in the position of being an organizational leader, or for that matter, really any position in life, but particularly an organization, leadership role, and you're going to act like a spoiled child or a whiny child or a constantly self-pitying idiot, um, you may think you're going to get sympathy that way, and you may for a little while, but ultimately it's going to turn everybody off. But in your daily life, it will just turn people off to you. In a public life, it will turn them off to your organization as well. And hello to Mary Cavalcante in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. I have always tried to make my message one of positivity, and I try to live my life that way. It was pointed out to me the other day that I am a horrible Pollyanna, and I suppose that's true. And it's not the first time it's ever been pointed out to me. Um, but you are who you are. I perhaps am overly optimistic at times, but I definitely always prefer a positive message. One of the things that I see in the world around me is that for many years now, we've been dealing with constant negative messaging, particularly from people in power. And I think people are totally sick of it. I'm a little surprised that they were willing to deal with it so long, but I see them turning from it with a sense of relief. And is that relief justified? Well, time will tell. But negativity is never, in my opinion, the desirable route. Now, are there times it's going to be the successful route? Maybe. We were talking the other day about violence. Violence and diplomacy are generally opposite things, although it can be an aspect of diplomacy. But I would always prefer the diplomatic route. But that doesn't mean violence is not effective. Violence is probably the most effective tool. It's just the one we least want to use for obvious and good reasons. But in terms of getting what the people who use it want, it's usually pretty successful. And we just need to look at all those witch wars to see how successful in the short term all of that emotional violence was. It usually did destroy the people they wanted to destroy. It also destroyed the people who were trying to do the destroying. But they weren't thinking about themselves. They were only thinking about what they didn't like. And again, many of those communities that were once quite robust are now in ashes. Some are rebuilding. And my message is that we must not do that again. We need to look at the nuclear apocalypse of the pagan community in the 1990s and early 2000s and not repeat it. We gained nothing. A few people gained a sense of self-importance in very small pools. But as a community, we lost tremendously. And so my hope is that we will seek a more diplomatic future. And are we going to find that more diplomatic future? Well, I don't know. Hopefully my tradition will continue to follow that path. And one of the things about diplomacy, which I think I probably said on Monday, I'm going to say it again today, When you're trying to build something, whether it's an organization or a community, you want to involve the people who want to be involved. If people oppose it, if they don't want to do it, don't try to bring them in. They're only going to sabotage it once they're there. Work with the people who want to work with it. Going back to what I was just saying about hopeful messages versus negative messages, the people who love those negative messages are not going to embrace the hopeful messages. They just need to be left on the side of the road. The people who don't want a strong pagan community, the people who want to sabotage that community for the benefit of their tiny group of 5 people meeting in the basement, which is usually what it comes down to, leave them on the side of the road. They're not helping. Not everyone needs to be involved. Not everybody honestly deserves to be involved. And I think that in a community where people so often talk about the worthy people and only involving the right people, they sure did a bad job of it. They often involved the worst saboteurs, the worst obstructionists, and the most destructive people. So all that talk about worthiness was nonsense. They really need to reevaluate as a community what they think is worthy, and what is worthy are people who are willing to work to build the common goal. And if they're not, well, let them buy the books. Let them enjoy what's produced by those who are willing to produce. There's always a role for them, but it isn't necessarily in the leadership. It certainly isn't being a gatekeeper, because if you didn't build the gate, you have no business being a gatekeeper. If you haven't done anything to build the group or the community, your judgments are not necessarily the ones anyone should be listening to. Which brings me back to those elders that claim nobody listens to them. And I'm going to make the same point I've made before. There are plenty of elders in this community that everybody is listening to because they are relevant, because they kept themselves relevant, and because they did the things that needed to be done. And there are a group of others who, for various reasons, are not listened to, sometimes because they withdrew and did not keep their bridges of communication open, but do have good things to say. But often because they didn't have anything worth listening to, and they don't have anything worth listening to now. But they will be the first to tell you everyone should be listening to them. And if you run into that elder, ask them, well, what exactly did you do in those 40 years that you were here? And is it standing now? And if they say, well, we built a great group that lasted 5 years, well, do you want your community to last 5 years? 5 years is not a successful group. 10 years, unless it was intended for a definite purpose that they accomplished, which is another matter. But if they were trying to build a tradition, it lasted 5 or 10 years, they failed. That is not a success. Now, it could have produced successes. It could have done some successful things, and that will be a different answer. But I often encounter people. I saw a conversation recently about groups operating on democratic principles, and could anyone name any that had been successful? And again, there was this group that did. That means it was not successful. It's not there. Which is not to say that there were not also a few answers that were more positive. But, and hello to Vivian in the chat room, who just got here a few minutes ago. When we talk about building things, now, I will say, and this is important, that not everything is built to last forever, and nothing will last forever. Life is temporal. But, if someone wants to tell you how great they did, the question is, what were your results? Now, that group that only lasted 10 years, they may have done some great things, in which case, that's a perfectly fine answer. As long as this is what they're claiming. Um, but if they're telling you that was the ideal pattern for a group that will make a strong group that will last forever, if they're not still there, obviously it didn't. Um, you have to look at what the results are. Um, and, one of the things in our community, and I may go a few moments over today, a lot of people are more interested in the idea of, quote, principles than, quote, results. Failed principles don't necessarily mean a lot. If you want to make a difference in people's lives, in your own life, in the community, in the world, you can do that through a short-term project. Um, but be clear with yourself that's what you're doing. Um, so often I see people who are willing to throw out the things they claim they believe in because they're unwilling to reassess any part of it. This is not technically part of diplomacy, but it's definitely part of leadership. You must constantly reflect on what you're doing, and is it being successful, and is it helping you forward? Or you're just going to go down in flames. And even then, you will sometimes go down in flames. I've gone down in flames and come right back. Um, and there's nothing wrong with failing. Failing is where you get your education. But people sometimes mistake a great moment for a great long-lasting idea. And those ideas must always be open to change. Um, the other thing, which I think I will end on, is if you are looking for advice in how to run an organization, how to be a leader, how to do anything else, look for the person whose projects were successful, are successful. Now, one of the projects I sometimes refer to is the Goddess 2000 project, one of the greatest and most successful projects in pagan history, modern pagan history. Where is it today? Well, it's nowhere today, but it wasn't meant to be. It was meant to be a project in the last years of the 1990s, leading up to the year 2000, when it happened as an event and nothing after. It was never meant to be anything after. So it was a success. Um, but an example of grabbing failure from the jaws of success was the Chicago Pagan Leadership Conferences. When I was involved with these as part of the Pagan Interfaith Embassy, they were events. They were created and led by Ed the Pagan. They were very successful. They were so successful that the community wanted to change them from an event to an organization. This was a terrible idea, and eventually went down in utter flames. As an event, they were great. Sometimes you need to know the difference between what is a successful temporal idea and what's going to last. I'm a great believer in the idea that marriage need not be eternal. That, you marry someone, you're together 5 years, you separate or divorce. That doesn't mean it was a failure. It can mean that everyone got what they needed from that relationship and moved on. It's how you look at it. This is true in life also. But when we're talking about things that are meant to go forward into the future and into multiple generations, success means doing that. And you cannot do that if you're not willing to change. Now, choosing what those changes are is a complex thing. Being willing to change back sometimes is also necessary. And sometimes it's very messy. And that's somewhat unavoidable. I had a reminder just the other night, speaking with an elder from a tradition that I was once closely associated with, that it's always messy for all of us. Um, it's just a question of whether the whole world sees it. No long-term organization survives without messiness. The question is, can you survive it? Can you rebuild yourself? Sometimes can you go in multiple directions afterwards? Um, and I was speaking about, if your 5-year organization was meant to last for generations, but folded after 5 years, it was not really a success. But it could have been if several branches came off of it that are still going. It could have been if it did important things while it was there. Um, but if someone is trying to tell you how to live your life, make sure you look at how they've lived theirs and what were their results. Did they get the things they wanted? Did they do the things they wanted? What were the things they wanted? It may not be what's obvious. Um, if you were to look at my life from the standard societal blueprint, which is all about making money, um, I did exactly the opposite. I started with far more money than I will ever have again. But making money was never my goal. Making people was my goal. And I feel quite successful in that. Now, I'll grant you, there were times last year that I didn't feel so successful, but I waited it out. I survived. And I got to see that, no, I was quite successful. I definitely feel that now. And on that subject of elders being listened to, I don't feel that I have any problem with people listening to me. Now, do they always accept everything I say? Well, I hope not. That would not be desirable. But do many people listen to what I have to say? Yes, they do. And in that, I feel successful. And again, I wouldn't want people to accept every word that I say, because I could be wrong. And plus, you should be using your minds. And if I've done my work right as a teacher, you will be using your minds. And that may mean that sometimes you'll say, well, Reverend Don, I don't agree with you on that. And you know what? That's perfectly fine. It's even desirable sometimes. And my response is, we can agree to disagree. As long as what as long as, to quote the saying I've quoted several times now, as long as what we disagree on is not my right to exist, we can always disagree. But particularly when it's how to do things, by all means disagree. And, if you go forth and show me that you're right, I'll be the first one to say so. And then to copy you and apply what you have shown me is more successful. And that, I think, is the attitude we should all have. So with that, I'm almost 10 minutes over my half hour. I apologize. Again, I want to take a moment to say that my Magic and Metaphysical auction that was originally scheduled for tonight has been rescheduled for Tuesday at 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern, because it's running directly opposite of some major programming that I think many people who would otherwise be there are going to be wanting to see. So, better part of valor. And Mary Cavalcante says, thank you so much, Lord Don. Thank you, Mary. And thank you, everyone, for joining me. Let us close with our prayer as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives, and we rejoice in your presence in our lives. And we thank you for the insights that you bring to us. And we ask you to help us to keep our minds open and flexible as we go forward. Help us to observe what works and what does not, and to find the best ways to do the things we wish to do in life. And beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks. And knowing you are always with us from respect, we thank you for your presence. And I thank you for your presence. And until next time, may you be blessed.